Russian forces have launched a rare daytime aerial assault on Kyiv. There are reports of injuries and fires from falling debris. The city's residents are being told to take shelter as explosions continue to rock the Ukrainian capital. Earlier today, the Air Force says it shot down dozens of drones and cruise missiles. Officials in western Ukraine say a military facility there was hit. This latest wave of attacks comes on the back of a series of aerial assaults, which Ukrainian officials said were the largest since the war began. At least one person was killed and several injured. The increasing bombardment comes amid speculation that a Ukrainian campaign to reclaim occupied territory will begin soon. And for more, we're now joined by DW's Max Zander, who is reporting in Kyiv. Max, the last time we went live to you, there were air sirens wailing. Could you tell us the latest on the situation in the capital now?
Right. So you said it earlier, Ukraine and Kyiv in particular experienced some of the biggest, in terms of scale and frequency, air attacks since the beginning of the full-scale invasion over the last couple of days, in particular over this weekend. And just 2 hours ago, while we were chatting with you guys, we heard air raid sirens going off. Again, we have a green light now. The situation is all clear. But what was unusual about the situation is that we had a large-scale attack last night, and now during the day, another attack, and just hours after the last barrages of drones and missiles being sent to the capital, Kyiv. We were actually able to see the Ukrainian air defense go to work, sending multiple projectiles into the sky, taking out what, according to a Air Force spokesperson, may be missiles that were used on a ballistic trajectory, which would explain why there was not a lot of time between the initial alert going off and the explosions. But as far as we know, there has been some damage, but there is no major damage reported, and so far no injuries as a result of this recent attack.
Max, Russia has ramped up its attacks on Ukraine in recent days. What's the aim and why now?
Right. So in light of a potential counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, one of the reasons, of course, is to hit military targets. But then another reason may be to find out where the Ukrainian anti-air defense systems are positioned, to send drones or missiles in, have them being taken out, so you can find out the location. So potentially be able to easier move past them. But then there also may be a psychological effect to it. We've had 15 days now, it's the 16th day of attacks by the Russians on Ukraine here. So this is also a psychological toll that this is taking on the population here. And it's probably no coincidence that the heaviest attacks took place last night and the night before, as the entire country was celebrating a national holiday, which is a Kyiv Day, which marks the founding of the ancient city of capital of Kyiv more than 1,500 years ago, something that the Russian leadership is very insecure about, Ukrainians celebrating their identity and their heritage.
All right, that's DW's Max Zander reporting from Kyiv. Appreciate your reporting, Max. Keep safe. Now, for months, Ukraine has been calling for more ammunition as it struggles to retake land occupied by Russian forces. Officials say they need 350,000 shells a month. And high in demand is the 155mm shell. It weighs around 45 kilograms with a range of around 30 kilometers. It is small enough to travel far distances, but big enough to incur a lot of damage. Now, the European Union says it's on course to provide 1 million shells this year, down from, or rather drawn from, existing stocks and new orders. So far, the US has sent 1.5 million rounds. And the US Army is ramping up production from 14,000 rounds a month before the war began to 85,000 by the year 2028. Now, DW has been granted rare access to one of just 2 American factories working overtime to keep up with the soaring Ukrainian demand. The ammunition plant in Scranton, Pennsylvania. That is DW's Matthias Richman reports from there.
This is the scorching heat of American support for Ukrainian troops. Forging steel for those all-important 155mm shells. The pressure is on here at the plant in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to increase production.
As the robot is taking the billets out and placing it onto the conveyor. So you can see that entire process right here.
A modernization drive of the plant began in 2021, even before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Now we're, starting to see, the fruits of that labor, in the increased parts that, we put through the facility on a monthly basis. But that's a long-term plan that we're beginning to execute.
To make more 155 millimeter rounds, the US Army announced a nearly $1.5 billion investment boost earlier this year. This should fund a new factory in Texas and contracting production in Canada. At the moment, this plant in Scranton is the biggest in the US. It's operated by General Dynamics. Currently, this plant produces 11,000 of these 155 millimeter rounds per month. Over the next 5 years, the US is set to increase output six-fold to replenish own stockpile and supply allies. These shells will all go to the US military. Some are then delivered to those allies like Ukraine. But the increased production is also designated for American forces.
If you want to prepare for a potential conflict with China, well, then you need a very different and far larger and much more, if you like, Cold War scaled domestic military industrial complex to supply you with the very large amounts of ammunition that we see are necessary in this kind of warfare.
Overall, it's a money-spinning project for weapons-making firms.
This is going to make some arms or ammunition manufacturers a lot of revenue. There's no doubt about that. But, that is the nature of, if you like, defense budgets.
These empty shells will later be packed with explosives, ready to be fired from a howitzer. Steel turned into weapons of war.
And for more on this, we've invited Camille Grand onto the program. He's a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a former NATO Assistant Secretary General. He joins us now from the Slovakian capital, Bratislava. It's good to have you on the program. Could you perhaps begin by telling us more about the importance of the howitzer rounds to Ukraine?
Well, as we've seen in the last year, this war is very much an artillery war. So the Russians and the Ukrainians have been using massive amounts of artillery shells and artillery rounds on the front line, up to tens of thousands a day on the Russian side and several thousands a day for the Ukrainians. So it does mean that it is one of the critical elements on the front line, both to defend the line when you're under attack, but also to be able to mount a counteroffensive, as artillery, the use of artillery is really critical.
And speaking of that,
in both instances.
And speaking of that counteroffensive that you've just mentioned, all of the focus is on it at the moment. Is the military support Ukraine is getting enough for it?
My assessment, which is, of course, a lot of this data is not available publicly, but my assessment is that the Ukrainians have received very significant amount of support from European and Americans, which enabled them to really make a difference. General Miley, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, said that 20 brigades had been trained and were operating with Western equipment. We haven't seen these on the front line yet, but they are probably in a position to make a difference, at least on a specific spot. So they have not been engaged yet, so it's hard to predict how strong or well will they perform. But there is clearly a lot of support that has arrived in Ukraine in the last few months, and that is making a difference on the battlefield.
And speaking of the battlefield, Mr. Grant, do you think that Ukraine's Western allies might reconsider their military support if Ukraine suffers more losses of territory and if, for example, this anticipated counteroffensive campaign doesn't go as planned?
Well, first of all, we obviously don't know the exact plans of the counteroffensive, and I would advise caution on judging it simply on the liberation of territories or of major cities. The reality is that a part of that counteroffensive is also to demonstrate for the Ukrainians that they have an ability to conduct damage on the military infrastructure that Russia operates in Ukraine, therefore making the point that Russia is in no position to prevail in this conflict. The Russian winter offensive has proven extremely painful and difficult, but achieved very little result, as it took 6 months to gain the control of Bakhmut, which is now a field of ruins. So altogether, I think the key issue for the Ukrainians is to demonstrate that they can achieve important objectives, but that might be more military objectives than, strictly speaking, territorial objectives in this spring offensive. But as the West, we also need to understand that this is not going to be the one moment in this war that will change everything overnight.
All right,
and stand ready to support Ukraine in the long haul.
Understood. Camille Grant, Distinguished Policy Fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. We appreciate your time and insight, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation.